as we get started, I am going to pop in our bio links because I'm not going to introduce everyone. I will introduce our special guest, Dr. Boyatzis, but I won't introduce the rest of us on the call. So in case you're curious about who we are and what we do, there's the links to our bios. Let's see. And actually, that just went to the host and panelists. So let me switch that to go to everyone. And now it is going to everyone. So welcome, everyone. As you're trickling in, please put in the chat who you are, where you came from, and maybe what you were hoping to learn or gain from our session today, because Erin and Joe will both be kind of monitoring the chat. I will try to monitor the chat as well. But on behalf of Erin, Joe, and I, our co-authorship team, we thank you so much for coming to hear from our special guest, Dr. Richard Boyatzis. You can see him here. I'm not going to tell you where he is because on your screen it may be different, but definitely he is the key today. So for those of you that are interested in emotional intelligence, at some point you've absolutely recognized that measuring it is complex, right? Finding that measurement tool, it's complex. So with that in mind, we actually asked an expert to contribute a chapter to our book, Leading Self and Others with Emotional Intelligence, and that's Richard. And then we thought, okay, you know what? Let's have him come and chat with you all. And this session is specifically us inviting him to speak about his chapter. So for the next 45 minutes or so, I'm going to be asking him some questions and really diving into his chapter. So about emotional intelligence, what are his recommendations on measuring emotional intelligence, how it should be measured, what are the different options, and feel free to, as we're talking, and thank you, I'm seeing all of your introductions. It's good to see you, Chuck. Good to see your introductions. Please feel free to put in questions in the chat because at the end, we are saving questions from you all. Erin and Joe will also probably chime in. And before we get started, I have to give a proper introduction to our guest. So Dr. Richard Boyatzis, he's a distinguished university, I know you love this and hate it all at the same time, but he is a distinguished university professor at Case Western Reserve University. He is known for his work in emotional intelligence and behavior change. And he does have a new text out. You can tell I like it with all of my little tabs here at the top. But he is definitely focusing on behavior change, and he has degrees from MIT, from Harvard. He's authored over 200 scholarly articles, probably more by the time we're talking about this. His research in intentional change theory has significantly impacted both leadership and coaching. And with a career spanning academia and consulting, he's worked with numerous Fortune 500 companies and government agencies. So it makes him a leading figure in both organizational behavior and management education. So you can imagine that we were absolutely delighted that he was willing to contribute a chapter to our text. Thank you so much for coming, Dr. Boyatzis. I guess.
Thank you, BJ.
Yes, it's good to see you again, even if it's virtual.
Right.
So I guess I want to start specifically with the chapter that we were talking about on measuring emotional intelligence. And if you could kind of summarize what you think we would need to know about that chapter, what would be your quick summary?
It's a brilliant synthesis. No, the challenge in measuring emotional intelligence is the confusion that was created early on by the, if you will, partisanship that evolved for who knows what reasons. Could be just defensiveness of typically, uneasy academics, but the issues of what is it and the definition of emotional intelligence and how would you measure it got confused. And in fact, most of the arguments are about the measurement, but they're arguing it as if it's the variable itself. So let me try to sort out, having been involved in the measurement as a psychometrician for some 58 years, there are a bunch of issues. Okay, first, what's emotional intelligence? Well, at the simplest level, it's how you handle your emotions and how you handle the emotions in your relationships with others. Because of the very fast way in which our neurons fire off other neurons in other people's brains around us, it's almost foolish to talk about how you handle your emotions without talking about how it infects or affects other people. Now, that said, it depends on your orientation as to how you go about measuring it, which backs into, oddly enough, I think this is a case where the measurement backed into people creating different definitions. So let me talk about the different measures, because again, as I'm saying, it's always so confused. There is a way to measure this ability to handle your emotions and to handle the emotions of others, that would essentially be psychophysiologically, neurological and hormonal, but we haven't gotten there yet. We haven't figured out, I mean, except NIRS, neuroinfrared scanning, and even that isn't as helpful because it doesn't get as deep and the pixelation isn't as accurate. But at some point, we'll get there. We'll have physiological measures to see. Now, one very prominent scholar, I should say, Karl Marchi, who was working with Helen Reese, both psychiatrists at MGH. Helen is now running the empathy research lab that Karl was, and she even has a book out on empathy and empathetics as a practice, mostly focused on training physicians. But they wired people up, in terms of brain and other bodily functions, and were able to get 12 different measures, kind of like an extreme lie detector test, which uses some of the same technology. And they could look at the degree of synchrony between a therapist and a patient. And even went so far, Karl Marchi showed us the one between I think it was an 8 or 11-year-old boy and his dog, the synchrony that goes on. But all of that's to say, in this marvelous book that came out in 2000 called The Anatomy of Love by Lewis, Amini, and Lannon, three prominent neurologists and neuroscientists, that we do have this effect on other people's neurons. Okay, that being said, we're not there yet, really. So what's the next level? The next level in any holistic model of the human being would be things that are unconscious, like McClellan-esque trait motives or traits, like the big five. Well, you could define certain cognitive processing abilities, what we used to refer to as cognitive intelligence or general mental ability, as a trait. I mean, most people go about it that way. I'm going to stay away from just IQ because IQ really measures a few of the somewhere between 12 and 18 different forms of general mental ability that really are going on. But that's trait-like in the sense that it's unconscious. People don't consciously, I mean, you think, but it's happening, your ability to process data. So your intelligence, I would offer as a trait, just like the big five, your agreeableness or your neuroticism. The trait level measures, the most popular in research, although not used much at all in practice, is the Mesquite. And it is seen as one of the first, although again, it depends on how you approach it as to whether or not it was the first measure of emotional intelligence. But the authors, Jack Mayer and Peter Salovey, and then joined by David Caruso, have gone to great lengths to develop some very creative ways about testing how a person processes emotional information. And they have what I consider a credible measure. There's always a little bit of methodological controversy about how it's scored, but on the whole, there are ways to look at it. And in the framing of it, they called it a performance ability. Well, in psychology, a performance ability is a trait in the sense that it's a generalized response to stimuli. And the important issue there is when they formulated it and first started publishing it in 1990, 91, they took a strong position that it is a form of intelligence and therefore it should relate to your cognitive processing intelligence. And it does. I mean, it's not a huge correlation, but it's a statistically significant, consistent correlation of Mesquite scores with your general mental ability, thereby confirming that. But I would say, and part of why I think, from my perspective, people don't use it as much in practice, is that because it's processing something at a trait level, it's a little more elusive. And the measure, while being psychometrically sound, is not quite as face valid because you're looking at how people are expressing things and then judging how you look at it, things like that. If we go more towards the consciousness of a person in terms of my comprehensive theory and other people's of human personality, if you will, then you get what McClellan had called in his personality book and back in 1951, the self-schema. What sense do you make of yourself? Now there, the other person who in various controversial moments has claimed he termed the expression emotional intelligence in 1987 in his thesis, Reuven Bar-On, also a well thought of noted psychologist. He developed, but he was approaching it from a more standard psychology point of view. So he developed a test that was self-assessment, and it was based on how a person thinks that they're handling these things. So some of the scales have things like how you handle stress and other things that are similar to other self-assessment inventories, personality inventories, the GAO, the GO, and some of the other kinds of things, Edwards, etc. Again, heavily researched, much more heavily used in practice than the Mesquite, but holds its own in terms of the basic validity and reliability and all those things. Now, once you move to the next level, which is what I've labeled the behavioral level, now you get into an arena that's different a bit in this way. I did the first competency study in 1970 that anybody's done under that label. McClelland championed the term competency with his American Psychologist, now classic article in 1973, testing for competence rather than intelligence. The actual roots of it are found in a 1958 book called Talent and Society, in which Dave McClellan and Fred Strodbach and Uri Bronfenbrenner and Alfred Baldwin met with a whole lot of psychologists. And one of the popular issues in the 50s that psychology was fascinated by, and it really grew out of the both horrors and hero worship of World War II and the Korean War, was how do you predict people's effectiveness? How do you predict their competence, their ability to do certain things? And you started to, actually, the first mention of the word competence in this sense was by William White in his great tome about lives. Also a psychologist at that time based at Harvard. But one of the things that they did in the Talent and Society book in 1958 is to say, up till now, psychologists look at things, especially in IO psych or applied psych, and talk about KSAs, knowledge, skills, and abilities. And the notion was knowledge was usually procedural or domain-specific content knowledge. And then later we added metacognitive processing, but it's knowing a thing or how to calculate something. And then skills were things like listening, and then abilities were things that really grew out of traits, or if not, were traits. And that's where people were a little fuzzy at the time. You know, what do you call self-confidence? Is it an actual skill, or is it a comportment, like a style? Well, what they posed in that book was there was something else that was more anchored in the actual behavior that people would use at work or at home or at leisure. And that's what McClellan picked up on. And he was my one of my faculty members and my thesis advisor. And in 1969, in the small research group that he had, there was an opportunity to start to study this, and he and some of the others turned to me and said, "Okay, you're getting a PhD. You should understand how to do this." So the idea behind the competencies were that you're looking at what you could call a behavioral habit. It's a set of functionally related behaviors organized around an underlying intent that results in, and this is where it deviated from a lot of other psychological framing, that results in more effective performance. Now, if you're looking at the competencies of a marketing director, it's in that job. If you're looking at it as a physician, it's in that job. Or if you're looking at it as a parent, it's in that role. But the idea was that if you took, so one of the many competencies that we started to uncover in the early 70s, and the book that I did that came out in 1982 was a reanalysis of the raw data from 6 really large companies and 6 really large US government agencies, looking at supervisory, middle, and top executives and asking the question, what were the competencies that they were showing that predicted effectiveness, using a different set of variety of measures of effectiveness? One of the things that comes out today we call empathy. I think back in my 1982 book, I called it interpersonal sensitivity. But one of the things that's very clear is when you look at the behavioral indicators of empathy, how would you know that somebody's showing it? One of them is that they listen well, or we can even go so far as to use the jargony phrase, they do active listening, like you're doing on the screen right now, BA. You're leaning in. I have no idea if you're looking at me or you're checking your email, but, and that's, if we're face to face, there isn't much else to look around unless, you've got some kind of readout in your glasses. But when you're on a screen, then it starts to be fairly clear. So the idea that skills are important. I mean, Joann and I published the first of any study about coaches' competencies that predicting client change a year and a half ago. We just published, or the second one's coming out right now. But one of the things that's amazing is back when we were wrestling with this in the 70s, people were saying, that's interesting, but what's wrong with KSAs? By the time the late 80s hit and the 90s, it started to be adopted as the basis for almost all human resource management systems. And, I'm glad to say I'm usually credited as being one of the 5 people who started the competency movement. Dave McClellan being, one of them. And there were 2 from the University of Minnesota, Marv Dennett, a very senior psychologist and senior faculty member. And I think it was Rob Silzer that was one of his doctoral students. And then there was a consultant based in Minneapolis, Pat McLagan. But what started out as a lot of controversy and, academy management, APA, SIOP, all these professional conferences about whether or not these competencies were things or just an artificial creation, people started to understand. It was fascinating to me that the empirical work that came out in my 82 book got grabbed up and adopted in Europe and in the UK faster than in the US. And part of it was we formulated how these skills were organized from the inductive data, but we had to cluster it somehow. And that's where we clustered it around what I called underlying intent. So listening is a skill. It can be a part of demonstrating the competency of empathy if you're using it to understand another person. If you're listening to somebody or asking questions to catch them in a lie, then it's probably related to a different competency called persuasiveness or influence.
Richard, can we
Yeah,
interject a question since we're on empathy? There's a question in
sure.
the chat that says, how would you differentiate empathy as a skill within emotional intelligence from the concept of being an empath?
Well, I think that empathy is a competency. I don't think it's a skill. I think there are constituent elements that enable you to demonstrate empathy, one of them being listening or asking good questions. An empath, do you mean like Deanna Troi on Star Trek, the second generation?
I'm going to assume that's what she means. Yeah.
Okay. I think that in Star Trek, in those days, it was used to be somebody who could read other people's feelings in their minds. Not quite like Spock with the mind meld, but she could sense them. Today, we now know this is a capability that everybody has, except those on the spectrum. People on the spectrum have dysfunction in the default mode network in their brain and can't tune into those circuits, if you will. But the rest of us all have this ability, and it's happening to us all the time. Now, whether or not we pay attention to it is another issue. Those people who pay attention to it become labeled as somehow different and an empath. A great example, if I can go back to another cultural illusion, the mentalist. And in the mentalist, you have somebody who was basically, not formally educated at all, never went to college, but he was somebody who was trained by his father from the time he was 8 years old to read other people and to look at, in that kind of Sherlock Holmesian way of seeing a whole bunch of things and then concluding something. That's what he did. Now, he would openly say during the series, well, I'm really a con man, or the question is how I use it. But nonetheless, he paid attention. And it wasn't magical, although for people who don't pay attention, you think it would be. So I would say there are people who demonstrate more empathy than others. And that's the way I talk about it. I actually don't ever use the term somebody has empathy, because I think that's a little odd. But I think they demonstrate empathy. So the behavioral level, I would contend we started studying and measuring in 1970. Now, we had clusters of these behaviors that predicted effectiveness in various jobs. And lo and behold, Dan Goleman, who he and I were we were doctoral students together in actually two parallel programs, but in a lot of the same classes at Harvard at the same time. And we became, when his 1995 book became a mega bestseller around the world, he called me and said, hey, can we do something with this? Because I'm getting a lot of requests for somebody to do something about it. And you're the one who actually does it, measures it and all that. So quite literally, we looked at all the data I was sitting on from thousands of these studies all over the world and said, if you look at these competencies, 80 to 90% of them in any job that predict effectiveness or role are what we would call emotional intelligence. They had to do with how you're handling your emotions and like emotional self-control and how you relate to other people, like empathy. So to some extent, the behavioral level, what I call the behavioral level emotional intelligence, was a relabeling of something we'd already been doing. But that end, now here's the very interesting thing. I had said the mesquite as a measure has a distinct relationship to general mental ability, or some measures of it. Reuven Baran's measure and other self-assessments, even the self-assessment using the mesquite model, all have a higher intercorrelation with personality, big five, and those kind of measures, because they're the person's internal representation of how they're handling this stuff. At the behavioral level, we started out saying these things are independent. Your general mental ability is going to be independent of all of these other things, and your personality is going to be independent. We're looking at something that should not have any correlations. And sure enough, excuse me, we have two. I mean, it's not a huge number, but we have at least two studies, one done with financial service executives and one done with engineers, in which we were able to show that the emotional intelligence competencies as seen by others in their performance and their behavior predicted their effectiveness, and the various measures we were using of general mental ability didn't. And in those two, we used the Ravens progressive matrices, which is, a key measure. In Joann, in our study that we published with the coaches in the medical school, we had used the ICAR, which is now considered a much easier to use because it's 15 minutes, not 45. But it's very closely related to the Ravens and some of the other measures. And we showed it didn't have any impact either. So there's a distinction, and what I'm trying to do is to say, I'm trying to articulate the fact that in a sense, we're all measuring the same thing. We're all measuring, but we're looking at it differently. And I would contend that we're looking at different levels of this thing, emotional intelligence. And I do believe that the emotional intelligence, or what we can say, and social intelligence, they're both a part of the same thing, because the human mind is not separating these things. Although there are some neural networks which are more biased toward how you handle your own emotions, and there are other neural networks that are more useful when you're handling other people's. But anyway.
And
so when you do the behavioral measure, it has to be behavioral. So the behavioral measure either means you're going to observe people and record them, which is complicated, because if you try to follow somebody around, you're there. You interfere with their behavior. So very often we've used simulations where people do video exercises and you code their behavior off of videotapes, or you use critical incidents of work samples and code what they were doing, thinking, or feeling at the time, or you use the 360, which is other people around you's report on how you typically act. Every measure at every level has sources of error. I mean, you're crazy to not think there aren't any. Of course there are. But when we get consistent, not just all three measures of invariance and good reliability, but good measures of validity against various things, then you start to say, I've got confidence in this. Now, the behavioral level is very popular in practice because of all the things that are imminently more observable, therefore face valid, and we showed with 39 longitudinal studies, more malleable in the sense of you can improve them in adults, would be the behavioral level. So I think that's one of the reasons why there are several tests, but one of them is the one that Dan Goldman and I developed, the ESCI, is in practice recommended as only a 360. Now you do self-assessment because you need a person's internal model if you're coaching them, but in the research, I don't even collect self-assessment on it. I only collect the view of others. Because self-assessment is something you use in coaching, but in research, it's more delusional than helpful. Now, I don't know if I was just rambling on or I answered your question.
what's so great is that you answered so many of my questions. As I kind of went through, I was like, okay, I would have asked that, and he answered it. I do want to highlight, you talked about the different levels of emotional intelligence. There is a graphic in the chapter that illustrates what he's referring to, which is really nice. And then I also wanted to ask you, at the end of your chapter, you talk about bringing all of it together. So prior to reading your chapter and having a chat with you, I probably would have thought that you leaned more towards the behavioral assessments because I know that you've spent so much time in that competency space. But at the end of your chapter, you talk about how a comprehensive, holistic
Yeah.
view of EI, right? So
Oh,
practically, what does that look like? How do we
well,
implement?
you know, if I use the analogy in healthcare, it's like going in for a comprehensive physical. So nobody's done this to the best of my knowledge. First of all, you know, passing IRB requirements and getting people, adults, willing to do this. Um, I don't do anything with kids. Hell, I've never 38 years as a full professor. I've never even taught undergraduates, and now I have trouble with 30-year-old MBAs. But when you get to my age, people who are 60 are considered young, so it's a different issue. But at any rate, this is what I would love to have us consider. Whether we're talking about using it in some kind of a comprehensive assessment center or process, or we're talking about using it in some future research studies, I would love to get some physiological measures. And in particular, given the relationship of sympathetic and parasympathetic, I'd love to get some dispositional levels of cortisol secretion, of testosterone secretion, of estrogen secretion in the person's body. And when I say dispositional levels, I mean adjusting for diurnal levels. So if you had a bunch of blood or urine samples, you know, you can get kind of a notion. There are some people who clearly have more of it. So they have more epinephrine secretion, typically often fostered by a higher ratio of testosterone to estrogen or progesterone in their blood system. That'd be good to know at the physiological level. If you could ever get people to sit through an fMRI, you know, using Tony Jack's typology of the opposing domains, it'd be nice to know if people dispositionally went to the task positive network or went to the default mode network to know how much are they analytically driven or are they empathetically driven. At the performance trait level, I'd love to have people take the mesquite. It's a good measure. It picks up whether or not people are actually able to do this. I mean, it reminds me, excuse me, of the best measure I ever knew of empathy was Bob Rosenthal and Judy Horniak's measure, which actually had a whole bunch of moments of a person expressing something, which were either content filtered, so they squelched the frequencies, so it sounded like a jumble, or they randomly spliced the tapes. So you would literally, when it turns out that people who could read the emotions being expressed under either one of those approaches demonstrated, it was seen by others as having a tremendous amount of empathy. It was a test that was odd for people to take, and they even had a version of it where you looked at parts of the body, but that is another example of a trait-like measure that I'd love to see. I think it's important that we get self-assessment because it's useful, especially if a person is getting a comprehensive assessment for themselves for some coaching or development, to know what's your mental model. You know, how are you thinking of yourself? Because if we're going to have you look at how other people experience you, it's important to know what we're fighting against, because very often people are going to argue like hell for their own mental model. You know, it's like, I think I'm a really flexible person, which really holds well until you ask my wife or some of my doctoral students. No comments, Joann. And then I think behavioral measures. And I know for 20 years, we subjected all of our graduate students at the Weatherhead School to not just critical incident interviews. So we got work samples that we could then professionally code, but we also had videotapes of several simulations that we would code and 360s. So So when I'm talking about a comprehensive assessment, I mean the whole thing, you know, multiple measures of the behavioral, get a comprehensive view of the self-assessment, which would include something like Carol Dweck's, mindset, and um, probably would include at that level values, self-awareness around values, and what I like to measure, which is operating philosophy, but the traits and what I call the traits or performance abilities, like Mesquite, and then even the physiological underpinnings. Like I said, that's a lot of measurement, and right now nobody wants to pay for all that, and to try to get it in research is hard because it's hard to get people to be willing participants in research. And every time you add another measure, you're adding time. So I likened it to an executive assessment because, in contrast to me going into my internist once a year, where, he takes a whole bunch of, 9 vials of blood out so he can run all these CBCs and other things. And then we spend an hour and a half in his office and he runs an EKG and a bunch of other stuff and talks to me and all that. I'm talking about several days of testing. In an ideal world, we'd get this comprehensive assessment because I think it would help us. Not only would it help a person understand themselves better, but it would help us in the research get out of this argument about different measures and different definitions when, in fact, I think we're talking about different parts of the same thing.
Thank you so much. And we're getting a private chat. It just occurred to me that not everybody gets all of these chats. Chuck Wolf is on the call, who is an expert in the space of group emotional intelligence, or at least that's what I cite from him. So he may be an expert in other places too. But he's telling us that there is a new version of the Mesquite that Richard keeps referring to. So I just wanted to let you all know. And I'm going to throw in the chat how that.
Yeah, and Chuck is an aficionado of the Mesquite and likes it a lot. I think it's not only is there a new version, but there are also 2 competing versions. 2 other sets of scholars have come up with things that they think are. I mean, nobody comes up and says, "I'm going to develop a test that's worse," but so of course they think it's better, but they're alternatives.
Fantastic. Thank you. And then I want to be thoughtful about other people's interest and questions. So I'm going to scroll back up. Julianne is all the way here from Switzerland, and she wanted to hear about your greatest insights from the topic, which kind of segues into a question that I was going to ask anyway. So I'll be a little more specific on the greatest insights if that's too broad for you. I was thinking about kind of like your key takeaways, things that you've learned that you think would save us time and energy about measuring emotional intelligence, because as you said, the holistic aspect may not be realistic for us.
Look to our relationships. I mean, I'm not just quoting John Lennon, "All you need is love." But I am saying we have spent so long thinking that the individual is the independent variable. And at least today, as Joann and others know, I mean, I pretty much, I'm not saying I force because I can't, but I encourage all of my doctoral students to use quality of the relationships that people are interacting with on a regular basis as at minimum a mediating variable, if not an independent variable. I think that's what we miss the most. We don't look at the interaction. So leadership, people still worry about the characteristics of a leader. It doesn't matter that much. What matters is the relationship that the leader has with the people around him, her, or them. That just because somebody reports to you doesn't mean they're a follower. As I like to say, they could be spitting in your coffee when they bring it to you. So what we need to understand is the quality of the relationships we have with people. And then when you start to think about that, then you say, okay, well, are the qualities of your relationships the same at work and at home? Are they the same in the morning and the evening? Are they the same? Are you consistent? Or at work, are your relationships better with people of one gender or another, or one ethnicity or another. So you start to get a lot more subtle questions about it. But at the heart of it, I use this quote in at the beginning, but then in one of the key chapters of The Science of Change, my new book, relationships are the agar-agar in the petri dish of life. They're the context for everything. And we don't spend enough time understanding that. Now, regarding emotional intelligence, or the big category, the outcome of it is going to be dramatically understood by your degree of emotional self-control and your relationships. And you even think about how you go about accessing it. I mean, I have spent many decades trying to help people understand this stuff. And even under the label of emotional intelligence, I've spent 30 years doing it. And Dan Goleman and I, have this kind of repartee at times, because he has always contended the starting point of more emotional intelligence is self-awareness, emotional self-awareness. And I believe that is one of the starting points, but one. I think that there are people who want to develop greater sensitivity and facility with their managing emotions and their relationships, start by looking inside. But my experience, especially in the last 20 years, has been that there are almost an equal number of people I run into, professionals and executives and leaders, who have trouble with that, either for value reasons or cultural reasons or defensiveness reasons. But if you start by having them look to others, trying to understand others. So if you work the relationship side, those people can actually go and end up, in a sense, backing into the emotional self-awareness. So I do think, and I don't think it's emotional self-awareness that's as pivotal as emotional self-control. I think Roy Baumeister was right on that years ago when the self-esteem movement was going crazy in California, where a lot of things go weird. But he said it's wasted. It's all wasted. You don't want to tell people they're great. You want to have them be able to control their emotions. And so here we are now, some 30 years later, and he was right. The net result is, generation after generation of people who are so entitled that, if they get a B in a course in college, they threaten to sue their professor, because how dare they? Or, Garrison Keillor's thing about the children of Lake Wobegon, where everybody was above average.
Richard,
Business Week. Oh, sorry. Anyway,
sorry, we have another question in the chat, and it's from Chuck. So people now use AI to rewrite certain difficult emails. No doubt there will be more uses of AI to support people's emotional intelligence abilities. How do you see AI impacting emotional intelligence? Hot topic.
I think it will help people compensate. But here's the danger. It's not helping you build your emotional intelligence. It's like the loss of the advent of calculators and of automatic corrections of Word, where it fixes your spelling sometimes without you wanting to, is that people have lost the ability to do arithmetic in their heads, and they've lost the ability to spell things without working with a spell checker. I think that if AI is leaned on to compensate for those deficiencies, the person doesn't learn. The product comes out better, but the person doesn't change themselves. So that application of AI, I see as a short-term or illusory win. Where AI, I think, can help the most in things like coaching and helping is when it's used to spur curiosity. And that's a little more complicated, but I know in some of the large language models and the huge data analysis, some of the most impressive uses of artificial intelligence in medicine are happening because people are asking questions that before they couldn't have sought an answer for. So I don't think artificial intelligence by itself is always a threat, but I think it's like writing. If our students are graduating high school without the ability to write an essay with coherent, clear sentences, with good paragraphs, we're trying to do rehab in college, and depending upon what kind of, if they play a sport or if they're on a certain kind of scholarship, sometimes they skate from that. And now, professors are going crazy trying to figure out, well, who wrote that thing? I mean, when an executive doctorate program that we have was reporting to me as an associate dean, the director of the program came to me one time and said, I've got a problem which I think is plagiarism. And I don't want to go into details that would make it renderable, but this person, this CFO of an energy company, was submitting papers throughout the first semester, and the papers weren't very good in quality and in their thinking. And then the final paper was very good, was excellent. And John happened to be, John Aram, the director at the time, happened to be after Christmas break, was in the library reading up on something, and he found a passage in a book. He said, boy, that sounds familiar. 2 pages were copied out of this earlier piece into this paper. And when he confronted this executive, the executive's excuse was he didn't plagiarize. He was so busy because he was, a CFO of a company and he was teaching ethics at a regional college, that he gave the paper to his daughter, who was an undergraduate at the university, to write for him. And she's the one who plagiarized. That story, which is horrible. I mean, we did force him to leave the program. We expelled him, if you will. But the point is, I think that's the worst fear of the use of AI around writing.
Thank you
I better
so
stop,
much.
otherwise I keep going.
Yes, yes. No, and I didn't realize that we're stopping at 10 minutes till. So that is
I didn't
my
either.
mistake. But we have very much enjoyed you. We very much appreciate you. We did put our contact information into the chat. I am not putting Richard's contact information out there because he's very busy, and I appreciate the time that he did spend with us today. But Erin, Joe, and I are happy to hear from everybody. We are here to talk with you about these topics and collaborate with you. We look forward to hearing from you. Thank you, Richard. Thank you, Joe. Thank you, Erin. And thank you, Kendall Hunt. Joe, go ahead.
Thank you all.
Thank you all for being here. I just really appreciate it. And I see some things popping into the chat, and thanks to Richard. Thanks to everyone. I think this has been a super interesting session, and hopefully we can have a future one as well.
Thank you.